Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll get started. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Agnes Wong. She's a professor of ophthalmology, neurology, and psychology at the University of Toronto, and still working as an active ophthalmologist and senior scientist at the Hospital for Sick Children. Previously, ophthalmologist in chief at Sick Children as well, and also former vice chair of research here as well. And she held the inaugural John and Melinda Thompson Chair in Vision Neuroscience for a decade. She's published over 130 peer-reviewed papers in the field of ophthalmology and vision scientists and many prestigious grants. In addition to all of this, however, and this is the reason that she's with us today, and in addition to all of this tremendous clinical and academic work, a major focus of Dr. Wong's current work is on promoting wellness in health professionals. And she's been integrating mindfulness, compassion, reflective practices, and systems thinking. Her approach supports healthcare professionals in developing vital skills to enhance their well-being and improve the system. And she's published some books on this, and in particular, her most recent book received a lot of critical acclaim, The Art and Science of Compassion, a primer, Reflections of a Physician Chaplain. So over to you, Dr. Wong. Really thrilled that you can join us this morning.
Good morning, Dr. Bernie, and thank you for the very nice introduction. And good morning, everyone. It's nice to meet you virtually. What I think I would do is begin by sharing a poem that I wrote several years ago now. So let me just get to the screen here and read this poem out for you. And the poem is called A Mere Spark.
We're not seeing your slides. Are you sharing something, Dr. Wong?
No, I thought I'd just read the poem first before I share the slide. Is that all right?
Of course, you're the boss.
Okay, thank you. So again, the title of the poem is called A Mere Spark. I cannot get up again today, exhausted, but the day has hardly begun. I toil from daybreak to twilight. When was the last time I bathed in the warm sunlight? I see bored children in blue gowns, too weak to open their eyes, waiting for the next rounds. I see palm-sized babies in clear cubicles, hooked up to wires from head to toe, hoping for miracles. I see weary heads keeping down, struggling through another day, trying hard not to get drowned. They say this is where you can make a difference, giving the best care par excellence. They say this is where the battles are fought, fighting against limits, but at what costs? I say this is a giant machine, chewing you up before spitting you out. I'm just a mere speck, powerless and voiceless to interject. I'm numb, I despair, I cry, but who cares? Will I come back tomorrow, engulfing my soul in endless sorrow? Would I abandon these sick children, turning away from my life's summons? Would I forsake this familiar lifeboat, not knowing whether I would sink or float? Deep inside, I could hear a faint call. Wake up. Do not squander your life. Wake up. But what am I to do? Please, if you know the answer, please let me know. So this is a poem I wrote several years ago, and that was actually, before I stepped down from all my leadership positions. And I think what I would do is I would share with you some of the reflections I've been doing in the last few years. And particularly, I actually, after I stepped down from my roles, I decided to pursue chaplaincy training. And one of the things I need to do during chaplaincy is to write a thesis. And I decided to write a thesis on the topic of compassion. And I would like to share with you what I've learned through my research with you today. So let me do the share screen here. Share screen and include sound, and here. Yeah, that should be sharing now.
Yeah, we see you. Perfect.
Perfect. So I'll go to the presenter mode. Let's see. Okay, good.
Yeah,
All right.
also perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. So just to backtrack a little bit, as I mentioned that I did a lot of reflection during this time. Um, my heart was actually really torn because I did the unthinkable. I not only did I step down from all of my leadership positions, I actually also closed my lab and turned part-time. But my heart was really torn at the time because I kept thinking, what would people think of me? Would I ever be trusted again? Am I setting a bad example for my kids and trainees by being a quitter? Because I've never really quit anything before. And also, am I wasting many years of training by throwing it on my experience and training out of the water? Now, facing these questions at the time was really, really painful and frightening. It feels like I've committed a career suicide or maybe death, because unbeknown to me, my identity, my sense of self-worth, and the sense of self-purpose have been completely wrapped up with my titles, my roles, and external validation. But I kept asking myself, who am I really? And what should I do next? So what I did was I began by asking myself what I enjoy doing most. And then I realized that what has brought me the most joy was simply meeting with people, listening to them, and serving them in whatever way I could. I also recognized that I've been increasingly drawn to the spiritual needs of the dying and their families, partly because I've lost several loved ones several years ago. And at the same time, because I've been practicing mindfulness for several years, I want to go to a deeper dive into the Buddha's roots. And because of these, I decided, as I mentioned, to pursue chaplaincy training. Now, this training has been deeply healing and transformative for me. It has brought me also to many uncharted waters. Like I started to volunteer as a hospice volunteer, as well as volunteer in prisons, working with prisoners one-on-one on a weekly basis. This make me realize that, you know what, I have been completely sheltered and lived a privileged and cocoon life and oblivious to all the horrendous life circumstances that people have to go through. And as I mentioned, doing chaplaincy, I also have done a lot of reflections. And one question that keep coming back to my mind is, why is the healthcare system plagued with so many problems? And how can I bring what I've learned in chaplaincy to medicine? And because of that, I work on chaplaincy, on compassion as my thesis. And this is some of the research that I want to share with you today. So when I first began looking at this topic, I really wanted not to only draw on the wisdoms that contemplative traditions have to offer, but at the same time looking at them through the lens of modern science. And I discovered that all the research is pointing to is the idea that compassion is a trainable skill. And this is based on 3 scientific principles. The first is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that the brain changes in response to our experience in the training. For example, we all know that, let's say for people who play the golf or play the piano, the more we do the same thing, the more we practice, the better we get. In other words, this means that kindness and compassion can also be cultivated through repetition. Now, another important scientific discovery is epigenetics. Epigenetics, as we know, is a science of how our genes are regulated by influences that we encounter during a lifetime. And scientists also discovered that mental training can induce epigenetic changes that help to promote compassion and well-being. And the third principle is that every human being is born with basic goodness. This means that when we come into the world, we are born with a predisposition for prosocial behaviors. And I want to show you a video of a study that shows that this inborn goodness can be seen even in young infants. And this study is actually published in Nature.
In this study, parents bring their 6-month-olds into the lab. At the other side of a long table is a hill stage, a red circle guy with googly eyes. tries to climb the hill. He sort of goes up the hill and then falls back down. He always fails at it. Then a blue square character, also with googly eyes, comes from the bottom of the hill and bumps him up to the top of the hill so that he's successful. On different trials, the climber tries again to get to the top of the hill, and then a yellow triangle character comes down from the top and bumps him to the bottom of the hill, so prevents him from getting his goal. Babies see this a number of times until they get nice and bored with it. So we
did I press something here?
Stop and basically do a choice measure. Moms are asked to close their eyes. An experimenter who did not see which character was which brings over the two characters to the babies and just sees which character the baby touches first.
Which one do you want?
We found that, impressively actually, almost 100% of babies preferred the more positive character.
What do you want?
Okay.
This is really a really fun video to watch when I first saw it. Okay, we can see that humans are born with basic goodness from the previous video. However, at this point, you might ask, if that is the case, why is there so many hatred and violence in the world? And this is where psychology comes in and shows us that how we actually behave depends on our emotional state. When we feel calm and safe, our parasympathetic nervous system is active, which promotes pro-social interactions, and we can become compassionate, kind, and selfless. However, when we perceive threat, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, leading to aversive behaviors, such as fight by being combative, flight by running away from it, or freeze by shutting down. Now, interestingly, in our daily lives, threats can come in many forms, right? For example, disagreement among friends or family or co-workers, difficult patients or families, or even simply being overworked can be perceived as threats to our system. So the key is to be able to reestablish a sense of safety by shifting away from the threat system through self-regulation to promote compassion. Now, this ability to self-regulate is especially important when we look at empathy. So what is empathy? Empathy refers to the ability to feel into the other's experience. In other words, putting ourselves into someone else's shoes. And I think the celebrated poet, Walt Whitman, captured this really beautifully. This is what he said: "I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person." Now, however, if we over-identify with our patients, it can lead to empathic distress or empathic fatigue. So emotion regulation is critical. Now, and empathy alone, what I want to emphasize is that empathy alone is not enough. And this is where compassion comes in. Unfortunately, compassion and empathy have often been used interchangeably in our common language. So clarifying these two terms are important. While empathy is a component of compassion, compassion differs from empathy in that it has three other components. In other words, there are four components in compassion. The first is attention stability. It is our ability to be present to our experience of others. In other words, to be mindful rather than turning away. And it also involves the capacity that neuroscientists and psychologists call meta-awareness. So what is meta-awareness? It is knowing what our mind is doing and knowing where our mind is. So let's use an example. I might be reading a book and I've been reading each word on the page, and then I read one page and then the next page. After a couple of minutes, I recognize that I have absolutely no idea what I've just read because my mind has wandered somewhere else. Now, but the moment that I recognize that my mind has been lost, that's actually a moment of meta-awareness, knowing that, what my mind is doing. And then we can bring my focus back to the task at hand. Now, a third component is perspective taking. we look beyond our own point of view and take on the perspective of others, trying to understand cognitively what they're experiencing. However, if we identify again too much with others, we can become overwhelmed. And this is why self-other distinction is important. So what is self-other distinction? It is the ability to see that although I care a lot about you, I am distinct from you. I'm not you. In other words, really setting a healthy boundary between myself and others. And the last component of compassion is intention. Now, compassion very specifically is the wish for all beings to be happy and be free from suffering, and to take action if possible. And this action doesn't have to be big gesture. It can be as simply as a kind word, a nod, or a hug. And without intention, though, we should note that then it is not compassion. So now that we've looked at the 4 components of compassion, we can see that empathy is only one component. And importantly, in addition to emotion regulation, there are other skills that we need to develop in order to be truly compassionate to serve those in need. And the good news is that numerous research has shown that mental training can help us to cultivate these skills. Now, we can broadly group these mental training or mindfulness trainings into 3 major categories. The first is focused attention. For example, mindfulness practice that focus on the breath. It allows us to develop more attention stability. And attention stability is extremely important. You probably notice that, we're distracted constantly in many different ways during our daily life, either checking emails or texting or entertainment or advertisement. They keep us from focusing on what is important, yet having a stable attention is crucial. Think about it, great athletes, surgeons, and musicians all exhibit an extraordinary ability to focus their attention for long periods of time. So this is a very important quality. Now, a second practice is called open awareness, in which we observe our thoughts as they come in and go without getting caught in the thoughts. Now, with open awareness, we can develop better meta-awareness. It is our ability to monitor what our mind is doing rather than get lost in a thought or get carried away by strong emotions. And the third practice is loving kindness or compassion, in which we send love, kindness, and compassion toward ourselves and others, which strengthens our intention to help, and at the same time allow us to better regulate our emotion. Now, what I want to emphasize is that research in this area has really skyrocketed in the last 2 decades. And I'm going to show you a few key studies that support the beneficial effects of mental training and the mechanisms. Now, first, with respect to attention stability, there's a really interesting study published in the journal Science several years ago. And it involved more than 3,500 people from around the world. It's a huge sample size. So at different points during the day, these people received a text message which asked them 3 questions. The first question is, what are you doing right now? And they had to check from a list of activities. And the second question is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused on something else? And the third question is how happy or unhappy you are right now. And really interesting is that the scientists discovered that people spend an average of 47% of the time not paying attention to what they're doing. It means that, we spend almost half of our life not paying attention to what we're supposed to be doing. Now, what is even more instructive is that when people reported that they weren't paying attention, they also reported that they were significantly less happy, as shown in this happiness score here. It decreases with mind wandering. And this finding is aptly summarized in the title of this paper. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So how does mind wandering happen from a neuroscience point of view? Now, as it turns out, there's a brain network called the default mode network that is responsible for mind wandering and for the generation of self-narrative. Now, this network is activated when we're at rest, as if the brain defaults to this setting when we're not engaged in a specific task or seem to be doing nothing. And that's why it's called the default mode network, as if the brain default to this activity when we are not really focusing on something. Now, this network, scientists have discovered that is actually very important from an evolutionary point of view because it allows us to plan for the future, review past events, as well as remember pertinent information. Now, however, it is also responsible for rumination as we repeat the same thoughts in our head over and over again. I'm sure some of us have experienced that before. And interestingly, rumination activities have been associated and correlated with negative emotions. In fact, if this default mode network is left unchecked, it can cause mental unrest, and studies have shown that it is associated with a number of mental disorders, including depression, anxiety, and obsession. Now, this network consists of 4 major structures. The first is called the emotor, which is resided in the amygdala. And the second is called the memorizer, the hippocampus. And then there's also a third node called the selfer. And the last node is called the evaluator. So let's use an example to illustrate how this network works using a hypothetical scenario. Let's say, I was crossing a street and was not paying attention. And then I realized that I was almost hit by a truck, coming at me at 7 kilometers an hour. Now, what happened is that when I sense danger, the emotor sends out a fear response. And then it activated the sympathetic nervous system. My heart started to pound, activating my muscles, so I can run across the street to safety. The memorizer then stored this fearful information in my memory. The selfer then in turn integrates this fearful information with a sense of self to form a story that is relevant to me through the lens of myself, perhaps by saying, wow, I almost got hit by a truck. And the next thing then will be the evaluator that adds meaning to this fearful information. For example, the experience could be interpreted as a learning experience, which is helpful and adaptive. So maybe I would say to myself, I will need to be more careful the next time when I cross the street. Now, alternatively, which is much more common because of our negativity bias, the evaluator then tends to replace the ordeal and generates a series of unpleasant thoughts. So, for example, the first thought will be, wow, I could have been badly injured. And the next thought will be, wow, I could have died. And then before I know it, the next thought will be, what will happen to my family if I die? So you can see how these negative thoughts and imagination in turn can re-trigger the amygdala via a vicious cycle and keep the default mode network active, even though I'm not in danger anymore. So then the question you may ask at this point is, well, how does mental training stop the mind from wandering and rewire the brain? Now, first, we have discovered all research, and this is actually a slide that summarizes many studies here in a very high level. And what research has discovered is that there's increased activity in another network called the attention network, which leads to more attention stability. Now, increased attention stability also enhances our meta-awareness, that is knowing what our mind is doing, knowing where our mind is, so that we can stay present. Now, with training, there's also more connectivity between the attention network and the default mode network, which deactivates the default mode network, leading to less mind wandering. In addition, it also leads to better emotion regulation as a result of decreased activity in the amygdala, as we mentioned, the emotor of the brain. And finally, mental training enhances perspective taking and decentering so that we become less focused on ourselves and respond so that we can also choose to respond more skillfully. Now, not only does mental training rewire the brain, it also reduces our stress level. For example, one of the stress responses in our body is the release of stress molecules in the form of cytokines into the blood. And these cytokines are responsible for inflammation, which have been linked to increased cardiovascular disease, as you all know. Now, in a study that looked at the effect of 3-day mindfulness training and relaxation, it found that meditators have decreased cytokines level in the blood even 4 months after the training. Remember, they only have 3 days of training, but this decreased cytokines levels can even be is still there even 4 months after training. And importantly, this was not observed in people who had relaxation training. So I think this is a very important study because it shows that there's a biomarker from a physiological point of view that mark this training and the effects of mindfulness. So if anything, if you don't remember from this talk, then just remember that there's like a biological marker that shows that mindfulness is not just another relaxation technique. Now, research have also shown that compassion can be trained, and with training, it enhances positive emotion. And this is through the activating of the compassion network, shown in purple here, that brings about positive emotions such as joy, love, and peace. Now, this network also gives us a sense of pleasure and reward through the activation of the dopaminergic system by the release of dopamine, as well as enhances prosocial connections such as maternal bonding and romantic love through the release of oxytocin, the so-called love hormone in the lay literature. Now, in contrast, when we empathize with another suffering, when we over-identify with them, empathy actually activates a very different network called the empathy network, shown in pink here, which is responsible for generating negative emotion such as sadness, pain, and anxiety. So we can now see why compassion fatigue is actually a misnomer, which you might have come across when you read the newspaper. For example, it's saying, nurses and doctors are burnout and experience because they experience compassion fatigue, right? So now you can see that the term should not be used. Compassion actually leads to positive feeling. It also has a separate network that is distinct from the empathy network, which is actually generate negative feeling. So instead of compassion fatigue, I think empathy fatigue is actually a better term to describe the emotional exhaustion and distress that when we are too identified with other suffering. Now, perhaps because of the confusion between compassion and empathy, and because we don't have mental training during medical school or during a career, and this is why in medicine, when we see someone in pain or suffering, we are taught, right? We're taught to be strong, to remain professional, to detach ourselves so that we won't let our emotions affect our clinical judgment. While there is nothing wrong, in fact, it is a very, to protect ourselves. And in fact, this is a very good strategy or adaptive strategy in the short term so that, we can continue to function. But the problem is that from a long-term point of view, the long-term consequence of suppressing or bottling up our emotion is that we may begin to feel numb or to become indifferent or even become cynical, which is a major cause of burnout. But the good news is that neuroscience have shown that if we spend as little as 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks only to cultivate compassion, it is sufficient to rewire the brain and to make the compassion network stronger and more active. And one more important point I want to emphasize is that intention alone, that is the wish for others to be happy and free from sufferings, even in situations when we cannot do anything to fix the problems or alleviate the pain, can still lead to the activation of the compassion network. And I remember several years ago when I went to the NICU or the neonatal ICU together with actually it's the ICU, not the neonatal, just a regular pediatric ICU with my fellow reviewing a case of a baby with shaken baby syndrome. We were both completely distraught because not only were the baby's eyes and the brain was like, there was lots of blood and hemorrhage in it. The baby was actually seizing on status all throughout our examination, despite our maximal anti-seizure therapy. And sure enough, the baby actually died several days later. But after the examination, I reminded the fellow that, you know what, even though as an ophthalmologist, we really can't do much to help the baby, we can still spend a minute in silence to send well wishes to the babies. So we did that together for, 30 seconds to a minute. And sure enough, after spending, a moment of silence and sending compassion to the baby, we both feel better and more peaceful so that we can move on to see the next patients. So what I want to say is basically that instead of being exhausting, compassion is actually an antidote to burnout and a source of energy and resilience. And another good news is that compassion training also increases our longevity. And this is where epigenetics comes in. If you may recall, there is a biological clock of aging in every cell of the body, and in the cells, in the nucleus, there is chromosomes, and the ends of each chromosome are structures called telomeres. And they kind of function like the plastic tips of the shoelace, when we tie our shoes. They actually, what they do is to act as end caps to protect our DNA from fraying. Now, however, they become shorter and shorter with each cell division and also with the aging process. And then when they reach a critical length, the cells will undergo programmed cell death or apoptosis. Now, thankfully, there's an enzyme in the body called telomerase that slows down this age-related shortening of the telomeres. In fact, the more telomerase, the better for health and longevity. And studies have shown that meditators have longer telomeres, more telomerase activity, and more telomere-related gene expression. So compassion not only helps others, it also increases our longevity through epigenetics. Now, for many of us in healthcare, when we mention the word compassion, I think many of us will naturally think about, being compassionate toward our patients or to our families or to those around us. We tend to give and give and give, and often neglecting our own health and our own well-being. In fact, I will submit to you that the lack of self-compassion perhaps is the most important contributors to empathy fatigue and burnout that is widespread among healthcare workers. So what is self-compassion? And this area has also received a lot of attention and research, and it can now be conceptualized as having three components. The first is mindful awareness. We pay attention to our own struggle rather than ignoring it, suppressing it, or thinking that it is a weakness. And at the same time, we're being mindful not to get carried away or become over-identified with the story that we tell ourselves. And the second component is self-kindness. We respond to our own struggle with a sense of warmth, kindness, and acceptance. Kind of just like being with a friend, right? When a friend comes to us, with a problem, we're kind to them, unlike, ourselves, we tend to criticize ourselves, right? So this is really about, respond to our own struggle with a sense of kindness rather than harshly judging ourselves for our own personal shortcomings. And the third component is common humanity. We recognize that, suffering is part of human experience. Everybody feels it, right? Rather than feeling isolated. So acknowledging that as human beings, we all suffer at least from time to time. So this is not a personal failing. So then the question is, why is it so difficult to be self-compassionate? I think there is a very common misconception that being self-critical is needed to motivate us to achieve our goals. For example, this is what my residents told me when I asked them this question. They say, you know what, I've got to be hard on myself, Dr. Wong, or I'm never gonna get it. Or that, you know what, the tough inner critic drives me towards success. But research has shown that harsh self-criticism actually undermines motivation by activating the threat system or the sympathetic nervous system that is fear-based. And although it could be effective to mobilize us in the short term, it is actually overall maladaptive in the long term by putting our body under extreme stress or chronic stress. And self-compassionate people actually have less fear of failure. And research shows that they have greater intrinsic motivation, better cognitive function, and emotion regulation, which enhance their well-being. Now, another common misconception is that self-compassion is, soft and fluffy or a sign of personal weakness. But research has shown that self-compassion is actually a source of strength and resilience to all kinds of life stressors. For example, research has shown that for those who are self-compassionate, they're better at dealing with chronic health issues or marital problems or parenting issues. And I have also heard of people say, you know what? Isn't self-compassion just about feeling sorry for myself or, wrapping myself in self-pity? But there's a difference in self-pity and self-compassion. Self-pity primarily focuses on myself, everything collapses around me, where self-compassion it is the exact opposite, right? Through understanding that suffering is actually a common humanity, we can then realize that just like me, others want to be happy, and just like me, they experience suffering. And as we experience this common humanity, something soft inside open to us, and then we can become more compassionate towards ourselves. And lastly, some may say, well, self-compassion feels like, self-indulgence, like eating ice cream, Well, the difference between self-compassion and self-indulgence is that self-indulgence focuses on short-term pleasure, whereas self-compassion is fundamentally about having a long-term view of our health and well-being. So I say self-compassion is more like eating green vegetables rather than ice cream, like if we have kids, we know, this is true, green vegetables is more important than ice cream. Now, and I think this self-compassion is really beautifully illustrated by the story Simone Biles. We know that Simone Biles is one of the most decorated, Olympians. And in the Olympics back in Japan during COVID, remember that in front of, the whole world, she decided to do the unthinkable by stepping out of all the competitions. And this is what she said at the time. She said, it's okay sometimes to sit out the big competitions to focus on yourself. It shows how strong a person you really are. And then if you recall, there's a happy ending in that Olympic. She came back for the last events and get a bronze medal. And then fast forward 4 years later, just in Paris last year, she actually, if I recall, she won 3 gold medals and 1 silver, right? So I think this is a really good story. It shows that contrary to the common belief that self-compassion means personal weakness, self-pity, or self-indulgence, or that it leads to complacency, being self-compassionate is actually a manifestation of immeasurable strength, courage, and resilience. And I think what the Dalai Lama says really captures the importance of self-compassion, especially in healthcare workers. He said, for someone to develop genuine compassion towards others, first, he or she must have a basis upon which to cultivate compassion. And that basis is the ability to connect to one's own feelings and to care for one's own welfare. Caring for others requires caring for oneself. Okay. So let's take there's a lot of information so far. Let's, take a 30 seconds breathing break here before I move on to the next topic. Okay. So now some of you may say, you know what, Agnes, I understand the importance of compassion and self-compassion. But the problem is that they do not address the underlying issues in the healthcare system that is actually the major source of our distress. And this is why I think system thinking is equally important. So what is system thinking? System thinking is an approach that has been widely applied in many fields, including management, engineering, biology, and deep ecology. And according to system theory, A system consists of coherently organized and interconnected parts in a pattern or structure. For example, we have cells which form organs, which together form individuals in biological system. Individuals that form social, economic, and political systems consisting of family, units, and teams, organizations, communities, and societies. And this system, in turn, are parts of the earth and impacted ecological system. Now, one tool that I find it to be very helpful to understand system is the iceberg model. And I want to use this model to look at physician distress. Now, in this model, as its name implies, an event is only the tip of an iceberg. So, for example, burnout is widespread, and as we all know. Now, when many people, when they hear the word burnout, they may focus or blame the individuals when they hear about it. After all, many studies have pointed to patterns or individual traits that are common in those who experience distress. For example, being perfectionistic is a desirable in our culture, right? Who doesn't want a perfect doctor, right? But the problem is that, it can become maladaptive when we set such a high bar for ourselves that is not achievable. Another common trait is the imposter syndrome. You might heard of it. What is it? It's basically, despite our degrees, our academic achievement and recognitions, we don't experience inner success, or thinking that, we're just being lucky, or, feeling that one day someone will discover that we are actually a fraud or an imposter. We may also experience empathic distress when we encounter a patient suffering and not able to regulate our own emotions. Now, if we go deeper, we will find that there are also many system structures that contribute. For example, bullying is very common, especially prevalent among trainees and junior staff. We may also experience moral suffering when we know what is the right thing to do, but cannot do it because of internal or external constraints. In fact, many years ago, when I stepped down from my leadership positions, I know that I was not burned out. It's only now I realize that I have experienced a lot of moral sufferings, and at the time, I don't even know there is a term to describe that experience. So moral sufferings actually contribute big time to physician distress. And I think this is a topic that is more commonly addressed now in the last few years. Now, we may also experience, other problems such as a lack of control from our poor workflow or interference from management, right? In addition, medical trainees may also encounter the so-called hidden curriculum. So what is the hidden curriculum? Now, unlike the official curriculum that formally stipulates the set of knowledge and skills required, the hidden curriculum is the unofficial or implicit values and rules that govern trainees' behaviors. For example, don't challenge your staff, or don't complain and just work. And it is perhaps not surprising that when facing power hierarchy, residents and fellows often feel silenced or powerless. And there's also systemic discrimination, whether this is based on gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation. And I think, to be honest, the reality is that I think we are all aware of these issues because we have experienced or witnessed them happening. So then the question is, why do they still persist? And this is where we need to go even deeper to look at our mental models. So what are mental models? Mental models are our assumptions or mental biases. And one of them that is very prevalent in medicine is the status quo bias. For example, I've heard colleagues who think that these issues will always be there. And this is actually, one of the conversation in the ophthalmologist listserv in Ontario. And somebody just said, what, they tell, this issue is always here, and the generations, they told the next generations, what, you have it easy already. You should just keep your heads down and get over it. So we can see how strong this status quo bias is within this macho culture of medicine. Now, another mental model that is deeply ingrained in healthcare especially in recent decades, is the intense focus on economic rationality. We all hear it all the time, to contain costs, or we need to maximize proficiency or enhance efficiency. It is perhaps not surprising that we experience this stress, because this is what draws us to medicine. This is not what draws us to medicine in the first place. We're not drawn to contain costs, right? We're not trained to do that. And this actually deprives us of the deeply humane and interpersonal relationships with our patients. Now, another mental model is misunderstanding of what compassion is. When we look around, while compassion is acknowledged as an important quality, I'm sure everybody in healthcare says compassion is very important, right? But there also seems to be an implicit assumption that we cannot develop compassion in the same way that we acquire surgical skills. There also seems to be a bad belief that compassion is soft and incompatible with science, or that it is limiting and fatiguing. And if we are compassionate, we will not be able to make sound decisions, or others will take advantage of us, or people will not be held accountable to what they have done. So now that we have explored compassion in this talk, we have gone through this, it's both innate and trainable. It requires self-regulation to bring about skillful, compassionate actions, and that it is actually a source of energy resilience. So what can we do to address the many factors that contribute to address in medicine, to lead to distress in medicine? And I think the biggest questions, that's why this is the bottom of the iceberg, is what is our highest vision? Since we're all interconnected in this system, can we bring forth our compassion to transform the system? Could we start by not only taking care of our patients, but also one another, our co-workers, our colleagues, as there's so much unacknowledged grief and sorrow that arise not only from our work, but also from the world. Just look around us. There's so much increased depolarization, hate crime, and climate change. And one more thing we need to note is that the deeper the layers of the iceberg, the more leverage we get from our actions. So remember, the most impactful actions are those that are based on a transformative vision. So this is my last slide here. I will quickly go over it. So what can we do right now in order to integrate what we have learned? I would say the key is to start by reconnecting with our compassionate intention. Ask yourself, what is your life's purpose? What draws you to medicine in the first place? Is it to serve, relieve suffering, and promote healing? If so, we need to transform ourselves first through self-regulation and self-compassion. We learn to attend, to be present, and to attune to our own needs as well as the needs of others. And this way we can act more skillfully. And then we can apply by combining our professional expertise, compassion, and inner wisdom so that we can bring about more skillful actions. Now, at the individual level, listening to a talk like this is a good start, but it's also kind of like learning to swim in a classroom, right? Without actually getting wet, we won't be able to swim. So do you think this is important and beneficial? I would strongly encourage you to take a course or go on a retreat. And most importantly, start building a personal practice. So I want to emphasize that, kind of like exercise, you go in the gym, you have to repeat, repetitions, right? So mindfulness is very similar. We have to repeat in order to build the muscles that we want. So if you're interested, you may want to begin by checking out many apps that are available, and the most popular perhaps is Headspace, that you can check it out. You may also take a course, and this is a program that through Serena Institute I co-facilitate. And also from a system perspective, what are some of the things that we can do, immediately? At the organizational level, you can, this is a perfect example. We can have this kind of lecture or in your divisions locally, as well as, various national and international organizations in which you belong, bringing this kind of training and this kind of discussion in these meetings. And if you're involved in medical education, I think this is very important. See how you can incorporate this into the curriculum for medical students, as well as residents and fellows. And I think it's really important to start early and give the next generation the tools they need in their career. And as we build our inner resources, they then provide a strong foundation from which we can engage with the system more skillfully. We can choose a structural or system issues that's closest to our heart, whether it is workplace culture, policy, or moral sufferings, so that we can begin to transform the system. And I also want to emphasize that all these elements are tightly linked. They are synergistic, but you don't have to do it all at once. Just choose the piece that interests you most and start from there. And lastly, if you're interested in further reading, there are a few books that I would recommend. The first one is called Mindfulness, an 8-week plan for finding peace in a frantic world, written by Professor Mark Williams in Cambridge University. This is actually the book that started me on mindfulness about 11 years ago now. Another book that is beautifully written by Dr. Ron Epps in Rochester, talk about he is a general practitioner as well as a palliative care doctors who roll with many antidotes, and how we can be mindful and attending to our patients in medicine. And lastly, this talk is based on my book. If you're interested, you can check it out. And I also love to hear from you. This is my email address. Just send me email if you have any further questions or anything that you want to discuss. All right, so this is the end of my talk. So what I will do is perhaps I will stop sharing screen so that I can see your face and come back to the room.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for your attention.
That was really, really tremendous, Dr. Wong. I'll give you a round of applause. That's something that we miss with these virtual talks is the human interaction. So I have some questions, but if other folks want to go first, they can either raise their hand or they can put something in the Q&A or in the chat if they have a question for Dr. Wong. While we're waiting for that, I'll maybe start then. So, I'm very fascinated by your comments on attention stability because, I observed this in my own children as they were growing up, just the impact of their phones and social media on their attention stability. And I wondered if, is there research to back up my anecdotal experience to say that, this generation's attention stability is worse than previous generations, and why is it, and all of that?
Yes, actually, there is a very good book written by Jonathan. Can't remember his name now, but I can forward to you. He's a psychologist in the United States who wrote his research is based. He's a social psychologist. His research is based on this topic. He recently wrote a good book that really summarized that there's a huge impact of social media on the attention span of especially teenagers. And he also showed that there's a very strong correlation between mental disorders, especially among girls with the amount of social media activity, as well as boys, violence in boys. So it's a really, well-written book for meticulous research. It's Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, I think that's his name. So check it out. It's a very strong coverage, very convincing.
Yes, no one ever.
Jonathan Haidt. Yeah, it's written here now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, if it's really so my kids were in the first wave of social media, and we were still learning about it. I'm hopeful that the next generation or this generation of kids have more help. Is there any other questions? Sorry, carry on.
I want to kind of make a comment on this. I think this is really a mentor reading, as one of the audience mentioned. And I also want to say, what is the best way, to teach our kids, right? And I think the best thing is we set our own example. Many times, we're sitting in this living room, my kids will be, watching the YouTubes or, interfacing with the phone, right? And I caught myself checking on my phone, texting all the time too, right? So after reading this book, I actually, I would actually just sit there doing not seemingly doing nothing while they're doing. And then when I'm just doing their kind of practicing my mindfulness, I noticed that my kids actually start to put down the phone and start to engage in a conversation with.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important that we start as an own example ourselves first.
Yeah, no, I agree. My other question is related to medical school. I graduated 35 years ago, and certainly there was nothing remotely like this taught in medical school. I just wondered if there was some medical schools that were actually starting to formally teach any of this.
Yes, there is at least, one, like several medical schools that's doing it. And there's one in New York that definitely, they actually have a compassion institute because of the history. So they are formally teaching medical students on that. And I think Stanford also is quite active in this regard. And, speaking of the nuance of it, actually, what I found is that teaching this to the younger generation is a little bit different. Because what I teach here is particularly helpful for the generations who've gone through medical school without the training, because we are kind of like, we are trained to be martyrs. And this, especially self-compassion, is very important. Whereas a younger generation, perhaps after COVID, they are a little bit more, I would say they're focusing a little bit more on themselves. So it's more important to really distinguish what is self-focused behavior and what is true self-compassion. So this is also a very important topic, rather than just, sometimes it's just, just mental health day, which is good. I think I would appreciate mental health day, when I was a resident, at least I can do some errands, get a haircut, etc. But there's more to it. So I just want to emphasize there's more to just taking time off. How do we present a curriculum, just like these schools, is very important.
Yeah, no, it's so important, and I see the whole culture of napping that this generation do, which we never.
I love to nap too, but exactly, I think that's the right point. It's not about napping; it's also, right. So yeah.
I'm Andreas. You had your hand up briefly. Andreas is the happiest member of our division, so he's the wellness lead. But I see he's traveling, so I'm not sure his internet connection is great. But anyway, we'll maybe wrap things up there. I do appreciate you taking the time, Dr. Wong, and we're going to think very carefully about how we can introduce some of these concepts into our division. A lot of it's very personal, as you say, but I do deeply appreciate you taking the time, and deeply appreciate your work as well, because there's so much we need to do so much better than just the way we were taught to be martyrs. Okay, we'll let everybody get on with their day. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.